I've been thinking a lot about sort of evangelical Christianity, the broader church, if you will. And I've been a Christian now, into this month it'll be 33 years since I first entered into Christ's kingdom. And I have seen lots of fads and trends and things come and go. And it's sad to say that, right? We live in a world that's full of fads and crazes. And we told our daughters one time, I don't even remember what we were looking at, but we were walking through a store and they thought, how crazy is that? People are paying money for that. And we told them, well, when I was a kid, you could buy a pet rock. You probably remember that, right? I mean, and that's what it was. It was a pet rock. Somebody got the idea. You could paint little eyeballs on it. Some of them didn't have eyeballs. Put it in a package, in a box, and it was your pet rock. And you didn't have to feed it. And you didn't have to take it outside to go potty or do any potty training. And it didn't make any noise. It didn't scratch the furniture. And people bought them like crazy. And you'd like to think in God's church, in Christ's family, that we wouldn't be quite so stupid, really, and so silly in our thinking. That the faith once delivered doesn't change, even though cultures change and times change and fashions change, that the message of Christ doesn't change. The message of Scripture doesn't change. And yet I would tell you, in the 33 years that I've been a Christian, I have seen so many fads come and go. And in the church, it usually takes the place of, what's really important right now? What is it that we really need to focus on? And I would say, while many of those things have come and gone, seeker-friendly churches is one of the ones I think of. There's one that popped up in the early 90s that actually is pretty biblical. And it kind of comes and goes, sort of like Rubik's Cube. I don't know if people remember what Rubik's Cube is, but that thing sort of, every once in a while, resurfaces as an interesting toy for people. And this particular craze was characterized by an acronym that some of you may know what it means, and I would guess some of the younger kids don't, but the acronym was WWJD. People remember that acronym? Yes? Yeah, okay. And you'd see it on wristbands, you'd see it on t-shirts, you'd see it on bumper stickers. Do any of our younger kids know what WWJD stands for? I know you do, Joy, and I'm sorry, I know you'd love to share what I told her earlier this week. Any of the other young kids know what it stands for? I'm going to help you out. The first W is what, and the second W is would. What would? Anybody want to guess? What would? The last word is do. What would blank do? No guesses, huh?
Do.
Yes! Awesome. What did you know? Yes, okay. Well, there you go. What would Jesus do? And it was this trend that was popularized by, I think it was a pastor in Topeka, Kansas, who came up with the idea, but it's actually a very biblical idea to simply ask in any situation, what would Jesus do? And that sort of be a guiding principle of our lives. In fact, turn over in your Bibles, if you would, to 1 John chapter 2. This is written by the Apostle John. He was one of Jesus' 12 closest disciples. In fact, maybe part of his inner group, closest 3 or 4 disciples. It's the same John who wrote the Gospel of John. It's the same John who wrote the book of Revelation. This particular letter is one of 3 letters that he wrote, believed sometime between AD 95 and maybe as late as AD 110. But most people put it somewhere there in the mid-90s. So this is one of the last things that was written that became codified as part of our New Testament canon. And let's look at what John says in chapter 2, starting in verse 3. He says, "This is how we are sure that we have come to know him." The him he's talking about is Jesus. This is how we are sure that we've come to know Jesus. By what? By keeping his commands. The one who says, "I have come to know him," yet doesn't keep his commands, is a liar, and the truth is not in him. But whoever keeps his word, truly in him the love of God is perfected. You know, there's something amazing about how well this ties into the thoughts that Richard was sharing with us earlier. It's hard to expound on this. It's so very straightforward and simple. It says, whoever keeps his word, truly in him the love of God is perfected. This is how we know we are in him. The one who says he is in him should walk just as Jesus walked. So it's a very simple message here. I mean, John he starts by underscoring obedience. He says, if we claim to know him, but we don't actually obey him, then we're what? Liars. And the truth's not in us. Then we can profess Christianity all we want. Talk is cheap. Jesus himself said there are many who would say, Lord, Lord, who would claim me as Lord, and even do good things. Right? The people in the end of the Sermon on the Mount, in Jesus' little example there, they're casting out demons, they're healing the sick, they're doing good religious deeds, and yet Jesus still says, away from me, you workers of lawlessness. So he says we can't just claim to know Jesus, we actually have to obey Jesus. But then John makes it really, really practical. If you want to know with certainty that you really know him, that you are in him, that you abide in Christ, you must what? Walk as Jesus walked. See, that's the biblical version of WWJD. Why do I ask the question, what would Jesus do? So that I can do likewise. So I can do the same thing that Jesus did. That's how biblical that whole notion is. But in order for me to walk as Jesus walked, I have to what? I have to know how Jesus walked. Right? I have to know how Jesus thought. I have to know how Jesus felt. This is more than just sort of let me outwardly imitate the actions of his life, but I actually have to really know him and understand the Messiah and understand why he did the things he did and why he lived the life he lived and the kinds of things that were going through his mind and heart and thoughts. It's much more than just sort of an outward imitation of life, but it's an imitation of the whole of life. In our family, these are things, and maybe you do this in your family too, but oftentimes when we're faced with a choice, and it can be a really menial choice, like what are we going to eat tonight for dinner, or if we're out and we happen to be getting a treat while we're out and getting ice cream, because our family loves ice cream probably more than we should, you know, there's often this thing of trying to guess what the other person is going to get. Have you ever been there before? You know, trying to guess. In fact, I kind of like to ask, so girls, which flavor do you think Daddy's going to pick? And Tessie's smiling, because I do this all the time. Because I'm really interested to know how well do they know their dad? You know, how well do they know? Or we'll be in a situation where we're faced with a decision, and Andrea will ask, so Mommy, or not Mommy, she'll ask, girls, what do you think Mommy would do in this situation? What would Mommy choose in this situation? And it's really important to us that they know. But their knowing isn't just based on just a visual observance of what we do in our lives, is it? No, it's based upon an intimacy and relationship. And that's kind of what we're getting at. It feels great when my daughters say, oh, I think Daddy's going to get the, and usually it's some weird combination flavor thing. I can't even remember the last one we picked, but I like the bizarre ice creams, you know, that like fried grasshopper flavor or whatever, and they know that about me. They know I'm goofy, they know I like weird stuff, and so, but that's important to me, that they know that. Can you relate to what I'm talking about here? I mean, we love to know that we're known that way. Kids know the goofiness of their dads. They know the corniness of their dad's sense of humor, right? It's no different with Jesus. Walking as Jesus walked is much more than just an outward observance or an outward imitation of his life. I know of people, when I became a Christian, I wanted to go into the full-time ministry. That just became my dream very quickly. And it wasn't because I aspired to a certain position or a certain comfort of life, which sadly supported ministry has become today. It was because I just wanted to spend all my time helping people to know Jesus the way I had come to know him. And over the years, I saw a lot of my friends go into ministry roles where they were supported by a church and being sent off to mission fields. And some of them did, quote unquote, did really well in planting churches in other fields. But there were some that was really interesting. There was one guy, in fact, he's the guy who went to Hungary to start the church there. Andrea was a part of that team, who he was known as this incredible speaker, this incredible preacher. He helped plant a church in Russia that grew to an enormous number of disciples fairly quickly. And he went to Hungary, which is a very different field, and at that time was the Soviet Union falling apart. And it was much, much harder. People just weren't as open. There was a lot more atheism. They hadn't been as oppressed as the people in the former Soviet Union. There hadn't been as much suffering. It was just a much harder field. And he did all the things that he was doing in Russia, and they weren't having the same result of hundreds of people coming to Christ. And in the end, sadly, one day he just disappeared. I mean, he literally just left. Did he leave you a note? I don't remember. No, he didn't even leave a note. He just didn't show up anymore. Here's the guy who's supposed to be the evangelist for that team to start that church there, and all of a sudden he was gone. And it came to light later. He had become suicidal. He couldn't deal with the pressures of the failure, his perceived failure of his ministry. And what everyone discovered about this young man is he was incredibly good at outwardly imitating all the cool church building kinds of strategies and behavior that you should see in a young evangelist. He knew all the right outward stuff to do, but there was a fundamental void still going on the inside about who he was. And so when all that stuff was stripped away, or it wasn't working, there wasn't a depth inside for him to wrestle through and figure out, okay, now what do I do? What would Jesus do in this situation? And the truth is, we live in a culture, even a church culture, that teaches us the same exact behavior. Right? We come to church or worship on a Sunday morning, and typically, how are we thinking? Right? I know what I'm supposed to say. I know how I'm supposed to be. Some churches, I know how I'm supposed to dress even, right? You dress a certain way, you look a certain way, you know the right behavior that's becoming of a follower of Jesus. But walking as Jesus walked is much, much deeper than that. It speaks to how well do I know the Messiah. So that in any situation in life, when I ask the question, what would Jesus do? Because we're faced with lots of situations that, frankly, I can't go to a book, chapter, and verse to say, oh, well, in that situation, in that job interview, this is what Jesus did. Well, no, I don't have that. I've got to wrestle through, from my understanding of the heart of Christ, what would he do? How would he be thinking in this situation? And so, to start off our lesson today, we're only going to look at a couple of verses. How well do you know the mind of Christ? How well do you feel like you understand the heart of Jesus? The whys behind the things he did? Turn over in your Bibles, if you would, to Mark chapter 9. We're going to kind of camp in Mark 9 and 10. Anybody know a distinction of the Gospel of Mark? We just read a book from part of a letter that's one of the latest things to be written that was included in the New Testament canon. And the Gospel of Mark is actually one of the earliest things to be written. It's not the first thing to be written. Probably the Epistle of James, they believe, was the very first book to be written sometime in the mid-40s. So not long, within a decade roughly of when Jesus was crucified and resurrected and ascended. But this is the first gospel that was written. And if the early Christians are to be believed, and I think they are, technically this isn't really the Gospel of Mark, it would be the Gospel of Peter. If you read the early Christians, they all ascribed this gospel to Peter, and that Mark was just his scribe who was writing down what Peter was sharing of his recollection of his experience those 3 years together with Christ. It's a great gospel. Let's look in chapter 9, starting in verse 30. And forgive me that we're jumping in the middle. I would normally tell you, don't ever jump in the middle of a story. You need the context. The simple, brief context here is that you've had the Mount of Transfiguration has happened, this incredible experience where Jesus has gone up on the mountain with his closest disciples. John was among them, and he's transfigured before their eyes. He speaks with Moses and Elijah. I have no idea how they knew it was Moses and Elijah, but somehow they did. And then they come down off the mountain, and there are some miraculous healings that take place. And then in verse 30, it says, they left that place and made their way through Galilee. But Jesus did not want anyone to know it, for he was teaching his disciples and telling them, the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of men. They will kill him, and after he is killed, he will rise 3 days later. But they did not understand this statement, and they were afraid to ask him. Pause there for a second. So here Jesus is talking about what? Talking about his death, right? He's sharing with his disciples, his closest friends, about his death. How often did Jesus talk about his death? Anybody know? Sense of how often? Not very often. Yeah, in fact, any of the Gospels, you can go through them, and 3, maybe 4 times is the most he talks about his death. Very, very little. In fact, in the Gospel of Mark, this is the first time he begins to talk about his death. And it says he was teaching his disciples about his death. And he includes some details there about how, or the circumstances around how he's going to die. Now that's the context for what we're about to read and what takes place. And I want you to keep in the back of your mind this question of, what would Jesus do? In fact, put yourself in Jesus' shoes and ask yourself, what would I do? So you can sort of understand some of what's going on. It says in verse 33, then they came to Capernaum. And when he was in the house, he asked them, what were you arguing about on the way? But they were silent, because on the way, they had been arguing with one another about who was the greatest. Sitting down, he called the 12 and said to them, if anyone wants to be first, he must be last of all, and a servant of all. Those are some very challenging words that Jesus shares with them. But again, I want us to put ourselves in Jesus' situation. He's talking to them about that he's going to die, that he's going to suffer at the hands of these men who are going to kill him. He also shares about his resurrection. And right on the heels of him sharing those teachings, his disciples are having an argument along the way about which one of them is going to be the greatest disciple. That's typical men, by the way, in my experience. You know, which of them is going to be the big guy, the head honcho, the most important one? Now put yourself in Jesus' shoes. How would you be reacting? Now keep in mind, they're keeping this argument sort of low profile, right? They don't want Jesus to hear what they're talking about. Of course, he knows. We don't know if he knows because he overheard or because he knows somehow through his divinity, but he knows that they've been having this argument. They've totally missed what he's been teaching. And put yourself in Jesus' shoes. You're thinking about, you've been talking about your suffering. And all your closest friends have been talking about who's the greatest. What would you want to do after that situation? Would you want to bring up the argument? And to talk about the argument? Would that be the mood that you're in? That I'd love to just dive right into this. I wouldn't. How many people here like conflict? Just show of hands. Oh, come on. Nobody here likes conflict? No, I don't either. I hate conflict. I think all of us in our flesh, we don't relish conflict. But what did Jesus do? See, there's an elephant in the room, isn't there? You all know that expression, right? That there's an elephant in the room. That this thing's been going on, this argument's going on, and Jesus decides to deal with the elephant in the room. He doesn't avoid it. He goes right to it. And it's just as interesting to me what he doesn't say as what he does say. We're going to get into that a little bit later because unfortunately this first time around didn't quite stick. But Jesus asks them, so what were you guys arguing about? Not exactly a comfortable question, but very, very characteristic of Jesus. He does this all the time in the Gospels. You don't ever see Jesus with a situation around him, an elephant in the room, if you will, and he ignores it. Or he kind of glosses it over, or he just keeps the conversation superficial and comfortable. That's just not Jesus, is it? No, Jesus, anytime he had opportunity, in fact, sometimes when you couldn't see the elephant, I think of the woman at the well, right? And he's having this normal conversation with the woman at the well. First starts with, I'm thirsty and I love some water. And then that turns into, listen, you can have streams of living water. And then that turns into about where you worship. And you guys don't really understand what you worship. And the woman is she gets a little bit religiously defensive, about, well, you guys say this and we do that. And where does Jesus take that conversation? Go call your husband and come back. And we know, right, that she didn't have a husband. The man she was with wasn't her husband, and she'd already had, 5 husbands? Is that a comfortable conversation? To me, that's the pin drop sort of question. That's you ask the question and it gets really quiet. And yet, that's what Jesus did. He always went to the pressing issues of people's hearts. He didn't avoid those things. It reminds me of something that Paul says later on in one of his epistles. He said it in Ephesians. We talk about this a lot as a family. He put it this way, that we are to make the most of every opportunity. Literally in the Greek, we are to redeem the time. Make the most of our time. Don't waste our time on superficial things that aren't going to matter in the face of eternity. But rather make sure that our conversation really is full of salt and seasoned with grace. that we seize every opportunity to talk about things that are of eternal significance. That's what Jesus did. And it's interesting to me here, again, remember, what he doesn't say, these guys are arguing about greatness while he's talking about suffering and death. And does Jesus shoot down their ambition? How could you guys be so worried about being great? How could you guys be so concerned about greatness? That's not what he says at all, is it? No. In fact, as he often did, and as is almost always the case with kingdom values, he flips it on its head, doesn't he? And he redefines for them what greatness is before God. And he says to me what are some of these are really challenging words. He who wants to be first, right? He's equating that with how they're thinking about greatness. He who wants to be great, he who wants to be first, has to be last. Last of what? Last of all. What do you think all means there? I'm a simple person. I think all means all. Servant of all. I mean, it totally runs against the grain of at least the way I am. Who wants to be last? I mean, seriously, who wants to be last? Last of all. That's not naturally how we think at all. And Jesus says not only do we have to be last, we have to be the servant. The Greek word there is diakonos. It's where we get our English word deacon. We have to be the servant of all. That word diakonos, there's about 5 words in Greek that could be translated as varying degrees of servant. And in this particular passage, Jesus uses the word diakonos, which another translation of that would be a minister. The common way a Greek thought about it would be probably the way today we think about a waiter at a restaurant. You know, it's someone who, it's actually a very fitting term, who waits on the service of others. That's what they do. Everyone else gets to eat while you wait on them. And so Jesus says if you want to be great, you want to be first, you have to be their waiter. You have to minister to them in the truest sense of what that word minister means. What are the needs in their lives, and how can I meet those needs? It doesn't stop there. Look at chapter 10. Right on the heels of chapter 9. And again, there's a lot of teachings here that go on, including things about divorce, things about the second coming, things about heaven and hell. That's more of Jesus doing the same, talking about things of eternal significance. And let's pick it up in verse, you know what, I'm going to back up. Let's start in verse 32. It says they're on the road. And in fact, at this point in the book of Mark, the entire rest of the gospel is sort of their road trip together on the way to Jerusalem. Everything else that takes place from this point on is Jesus is heading up to Jerusalem towards his crucifixion, and this is what happens along the way. So they're on the road going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them. They were astonished, but those who followed him were afraid. Taking the 12 aside again, he began to tell them the things that would happen to him. Does this sound familiar? We just read something just like this. Listen. Listen. We are going up to Jerusalem. The Son of Man, which by the way is the term Jesus used most to describe himself. It was his favorite term to describe himself. The Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death. Then they will hand him over to the Gentiles, and they will mock him, spit on him, flog him, and kill him. And he will rise after 3 days. So have we heard this before? I mean, it's almost exactly what happened a chapter earlier. where he pulls the 12 aside, because he's got more people following him on his way up to Jerusalem than just his 12. There's some sort of entourage or fan club following behind Jesus as he's headed to Jerusalem. And it says that they're just astonished and amazed. He's the one leading the way to where he knows he's going to die. And the Bible says he pulls aside the 12, and this time he gives them a little bit more detail than last time. Because last time, most of what he talked about is that they're going to kill him, and he's going to rise again. But here Jesus gets more specific, where he talks about they're going to condemn him, and he's going to be spit on, and he's going to be mocked, and he's going to be flogged, and then he's going to be killed. So we're getting very specific about the suffering of Jesus. And what happens right on the heels of that conversation? One chapter later, right? I mean, it is laughable. I'm glad Richard's laughing. I mean, it's like, what? How can this happen again? Then, verse 35, then, what then? Right at the end of Jesus sharing about this, then James and John. Now, keep in mind, which John is this? Same one, right? Who wrote what we read at the beginning of our study today. The same one who was on the Mount of Transfiguration. James and John apparently hadn't gotten over the previous conversation about greatness. Right? They're still wrestling through their desire to be great. It says, then James and John, the sons of Zebedee, the sons of thunder, approached him and said, Teacher, we want for you to do for us whatever we ask. Okay, pause. Pause just for a second. That's an outrageous question. I mean, think about that for a second. We want you to do for us whatever we ask. Have you ever asked someone that question? Seriously, have you? I mean, I would guess when I was a little kid, maybe I asked it of my mom, right? Because I just was that clueless, and maybe that bold, and maybe it says something about how I looked at my mom, right? And yet, this is what they come and say to Jesus. Did they have a misconception of who Jesus was? Maybe. Maybe. He's not the cosmic bellhop. He's not the ding-ding, and he comes and he does whatever we want. Maybe. But I do think this question reveals something to us about who Jesus was. How they understood him, even if it might have been partly errant. I mean, think for a second in your own life. What would it take for you, men who are employed, to walk up to your boss tomorrow morning? Do you have work tomorrow? Okay, so tomorrow morning, some don't because it's Columbus Day. To walk up to your boss and say, what's his name, Rick? Right? To walk up to Rick and say, Rick, I want you to do for me whatever I ask. Right, you're laughing. But what would it say about your relationship with your boss that you felt comfortable saying that to him? Because these are not children talking to their parents. These are grown men who spent at least 2 years, probably and then some, closer to 2.5 years, around this man. They have watched him heal the blind. They have watched him raise the dead. They have watched him rebuke the Pharisees. They have watched him clear the temple. They have watched him turn a few loaves and fishes into enough to feed a multitude of thousands, and then some. They've heard the kind of teaching that the crowds walked away, not just the crowds, but actual guards, temple guards walk away and say, nobody talks the way this guy does. They've heard Peter say, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And they say, we want you to do for us whatever we ask. Wow.
Ask and you shall receive.
It says something about the approachability of Jesus. Something that, frankly, religion has robbed him of. And I'm not talking about buddy, he's my pal, Jesus is my co-pilot. That's not what I mean. But there was something about Jesus' love that made him incredibly approachable. That the people closest to him weren't afraid to say some of the most outrageous things. I mean, even think about that time where, right, when Peter, this is Matthew 16, Peter is telling him, you are the Christ. And Jesus says, you're right. And I tell you that on this rock of your confession, I'm going to build my church. First time the word church is used in the New Testament. I'm going to build my church. And you're going to have the keys, right? I mean, it's just, and the gates of Hades won't prevail against it. It's incredible, right? I mean, Peter's got it right once. The most important thing to get right, who Jesus is. And right on the heels of that, when Peter has just acknowledged, I am speaking to my Creator. I am speaking to God incarnate. I am speaking to the promise of the ages, to the fulfillment of all the prophecies. And when Jesus starts to share with Peter about, I'm going to go to the cross, because he does the same thing there. He starts talking about how he's going to be handed over to die. Peter takes him aside. I mean, he actually grabs Jesus and he pulls him aside and begins to rebuke him. Never, Lord! How do you do that with the incarnation of the Creator of the universe? See, I think it says something amazing about how approachable Jesus was, about the kind of love he had for people that the closer people got to him, the more they felt like they could just be who they were and say what they felt and ask whatever they wanted. If someone asked you, Richard, I want you to do for me whatever I ask, what would you be thinking? See, Jesus' response here is amazing. It is so not like the way I would respond. And let's not forget the context. He's just been talking about his suffering. He's been talking about, I'm going to get flogged. I'm going to get spit on. And look at what he didn't say. Right? He didn't say, this would be what I would say, right? This is me and my flesh. Well, that depends. What is it you want? Right? It depends. Jesus doesn't say, well, that depends, or you don't really get to ask that question. That's too broad. Can you be more specific? Now, he is going to ask them, well, what is it that you want? But he doesn't put those qualifiers in front. Or this is another one that I could easily see myself doing, and sadly those who know me know this about me. Guys, did you just hear what I taught you? I mean, were you even paying attention? Do you understand the suffering that I'm about to go through? And that's what I would be feeling. If anybody was misunderstood, Jesus was. Right? If anybody could ever claim that no one could relate to them and really understood what they were feeling, Jesus could claim that, and it would be 100% accurate. But that's not what Jesus says. His answer is very simple, and it is without a qualifier. It's without a, it depends. It's simple. What would Jesus do? What do you want me to do? And I think his response betrays something very fundamental about the heart of God exhibited to us in the incarnation is Christ. And Jesus even goes on to explain it. Because what Jesus is about to explain is not new. In fact, he just said it a chapter before. And what maybe they missed when he said it a chapter before is he's describing himself. See, what are James and John thinking about in this interaction? Or rather, who are they thinking about? Themselves, right? I want to be on your right and on your left. Because that's where they're going with this. I mean, we want the top dog seats next to your throne there, Jesus. Let us be the two guys, and we were right up on that mountain with you. Come on. I mean, they're thinking about themselves. They're thinking, what can Jesus do for me? They're thinking about what they wanted from God in the flesh. What did Jesus come thinking about? Did he come thinking about what they could do for him? Look at what he says. Verse 36, what do you want me to do for you? He asked them. They answered him, allow us to sit at your right and at your left in your glory. But Jesus said to them, you don't know what you're asking. Are you able to drink the cup I drink? Or to be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with? Now, how recently did he talk about the cup he had to drink? Just a few breaths ago. We are able, they told him. Okay, Jesus said to them, you will drink the cup I drink. So he knew, you are going to drink this cup. And you will be baptized with the baptism I'm baptized with. But to sit on my right or my left, it's not mine to give. Again, what an amazingly gracious response. Does he rebuke them in their selfishness? No, it's not mine to give. It's for those for whom it has been prepared. When the other 10 disciples heard this, they began to be indignant with James and John. I'm not going to get into the psychology of what might have been going on there. You know, I don't know if maybe when they heard Jesus say it's for those who've been prepared, they're thinking, you know, I'm one of those that is prepared. How could they dare ask that question? I don't know. But Jesus, always delighted to deal with the elephant in the room, he called them over and he said to them, you know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles, they dominate them. And their men of high positions exercise power over them. But it must not be like that among you. On the contrary, whoever wants to become great among you, I've heard this before, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. Here's where he ups the ante. And whoever wants to be first among you must be, some of your Bibles have a bogus made-up English word to translate the Greek word here. So I'm going to give you the actual translation. Must be a slave to all. See, bondservant, that word didn't exist until about, 50, 60 years ago. Because slave was not a popular word to stick into a translation of the Bible. But the word Jesus used here is the word doulos. And unlike many words that can have many translations, the Greek word doulos only ever had one translation, period. It meant one thing to a Greek speaker then and a Greek speaker now. And it meant slave. And in case you're wondering, what does it mean to be a slave? The answer is yes. It means exactly what you think it means. It means exactly what you think it means. It was not a desirable occupation. It's not even an occupation. It's a role in life. They were the lowest of the low in society. They were the dregs of society. It was an anathema to someone to think of being a slave because you had no freedom. You had no rights. You had no say in anything. You were property. And you existed for one purpose, and that was to do whatever your master told you to do. Period. See, the last time Jesus used the word diakonos, and he uses it in this passage. Right? Anyone who wants to be great, you have to be a diakonos, but whoever wants to be first among you must be a slave to all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served. That's not why I'm here. That's not why I came. That is not my purpose, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. How many times did Jesus in the Gospels explain why he had to die? Not just that he was going to die, but why he had to die? Once. And it's right here. It's the only time that he ever explains a little bit of what the reason behind his sacrifice was going to be. You see, Jesus didn't come thinking about what we could do for him or what they could do for him. It's exactly the opposite. He came with one thing. What can I do, give up for them? And I think that's what's portrayed in his answer. What do you want me to do? He answers like a slave. He doesn't answer like a master, and we know he's the master. We know he's Lord of all. We know he is the supreme being in the universe who is worthy of all of our adoration and all of our worship and all of our everything. And he's the one who says, what do you want me to do for you? See, and he tried to help them understand. This is what it's going to mean for you. There's sacrifice, there's suffering accompanying your request and your desire. I don't think they're thinking that. I think they're thinking glory and adventure and what's in it for them. But Jesus once again explains what real greatness looks like. And again he says, this is the way it is in the world. This is the way the world thinks about life. Everybody wants to be first. Everybody wants to be first. We all want attention. We all want to be noticed. We all want to be served. We all want to know that somehow we're better. And I don't know if you can relate to that or if you're in touch with it. I struggle with this all the time. I find my mind and my heart going to comparing with other people because I want to know that somehow, some way I can find a reason to think that I'm better off. We compare ourselves to other people all the time for this reason. Because in our flesh, we don't want to be last. And it's sad, some of you heard me joke about this, this is sadly true of the, and I'm going to put it in quotation marks, the church, and by that I mean the professing church. I mean, it's sad and we don't even recognize it. We put it in the names of our churches. On the way here this morning, I passed, on the back roads, I passed 2 church buildings called the First Church of fill in the blank. Right? How many towns can you think of you go through and there's the First Presbyterian and there's First Baptist and there's First Methodist and there's First Church of God and first. You don't ever see a sign that says the last church of Christ. Or even, you know what, I'd settle for the second church of the brethren. Or the third church of the brethren. We stick it up there in a big sign to advertise who we are. We're the first. And you know, we can joke about it, but It's not really funny. Because Jesus said, not so with you. That's the world. That is not how you're supposed to be. We're supposed to be the total opposite of that. And he explains his heart, which I'm so grateful, because now I can know exactly what's in his heart. He said, I came to give myself away for you. So if you want to be first, everybody comes before you. That's what slave of all means. I've heard this teaching a lot. I've heard these passages a lot. And I would say I am really challenged. I am really challenged by what Jesus has to say here. Like I said, who wants to be like? I want to be somebody. I don't want to be a nobody. Ever felt that way before? And yet, Jesus is teaching us it's the holy nobodies who are actually going to be first in the age to come. It's hard for me even to imagine wanting to be last. So, let's bring it back to John and what he said. Like we're supposed to walk as Jesus walked. So how do you do that practically? I mean, this is what Jesus would do, but this is much more than a set of actions, isn't it? Is it possible to serve and to minister and to have the outward actions trying to be a slave of others, but not have the heart? Is that possible? I think it is. I know it is. I've done it. And we disciple our children in it all the time, that it's not okay to obey mommy and daddy with a pout on your face. It's not okay to grunt under your breath. It's not okay to not be cheerful in your service. Look for just a second. This is our last verse, what Paul said in Philippians 2. Whether you turn over there literally or digitally. Philippians chapter 2. Again, a familiar passage. I know we know this passage. I know we do. That's a danger. So open your hearts. If then, verse 1, there is any encouragement in Christ, and I hope there is, any consolation of love, if it comforts you to know how deeply loved you are, if any fellowship with the Spirit, everyone who is truly been born again should have the Spirit living inside of them. If any affection and mercy, fulfill my joy by thinking the same way, having the same love, sharing the same feelings, focusing on one goal. Okay, what is that one goal? We just talked about all the things that I've been given, all the blessings that have been showered and continue to be showered down upon my life. Do nothing out of rivalry. What's rivalry? What's he talking about there? What's rivalry? Yeah, some of yours will say selfish ambition. Rivalry, it's competition. Again, I'm comparing myself with others. I worry about who's better or who's more important or who's getting more attention. Do nothing out of rivalry or conceit. That's pride. That's thinking more highly of myself than I think of others. But in humility, consider others as more important than yourselves. I could stop there and I would be on the floor. Everybody's more important than me. Everyone should look out not only for his own interests, but also for the interests of others. Make your own attitude. See, it's not just about what I do. It is about how I think and how I feel. And that translating into my actions. Make your own attitude that of Christ Jesus. And what was his attitude? Who existing in the form of God, who was the creator of the universe, who was the one who said, let there be light, and there was light. Who was the one who formed out of the dust a figure and breathed into it the breath of life, and it became a living being. The one who, with a tiny little passage in the first page of the Bible, just made the stars also. Who, existing in the form of God, did not consider equality with God as something to be used for his own advantage. Instead, he emptied himself. How did he do that? By assuming the form of a slave. Same Greek word, doulos. Taking on the likeness of men. And when he had come as a man in his external form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. What does Paul say? Our attitude should be just like Jesus. Even though he was better, is better, even though he was divinity, even though he is unique in all the universe, those are not the thoughts that were going through Christ's mind. No, he poured him, he literally, that word is emptied. He emptied himself, he humbled himself, and he took the form of a slave. So let's do a little exercise to make it practical. All of us this morning did some things in common. We all got up, right? I hope so. We're not sleeping now. We all got up, we all got ready, and we all came together to this place for corporate worship. What were you thinking about this morning as you were preparing to come? What was going through your mind about why you were coming and what your expectations were in coming? And I hope for none of us, though I know this is a struggle, it wasn't just because this is what I do on Sunday morning. That it wasn't just a routine and that's why. But I know the temptation, and I'm speaking out of my own life experience, is, were you wondering, I wonder if the lesson's going to be any good. I wonder if the singing's going to be better than it was last week. I wonder what I'm going to get out of the service. I mean, we don't think in that language, but a lot of it has to do with, I wonder if the worship's going to be good for me. Can you relate to what I'm saying? Right? We come with an expectation rather than with a purpose. And so we have to ask, what would Jesus do? We're right back to the really simple. I mean, Jesus is walking into a place where there's going to be corporate worship. Why would he come? And what would he do? Would Jesus just go and sit down somewhere and just sit? Is that what Jesus would do? Would Jesus be concerned about making sure he had the right seat or where he wanted to be? Would Jesus just sort of keep to himself? Maybe hang off in a corner quietly and just sit and wait until things got started? What would Jesus do? So I think this comes down to very practical. This is what John is saying about if anyone claims to know him. Would Jesus, if he was sitting next to someone, just sit quietly and not engage them? Would Jesus get up to greet people as they came in? Would he strive to be friendly and warm and communicate love? Here's a good one. Would Jesus engage people? Do you think he'd ask questions? What kind of questions would Jesus ask? If the answer to that is yes. And I realize not all of us are as gifted as others in conversation and in interaction and in drawing people out. But what's our calling? What's the goal in front of us? Is it to just be who we are? Is that the goal? Or is the goal that we're meant to become like him? We're meant to, right? I mean, they're wanting the right and left, and Jesus is saying, you don't know what you're asking. There's suffering and sacrifice associated with this. But if we went on, we know that Jesus said, there's suffering and sacrifice for everyone who wants to follow me. In fact, if you want to follow me, you got to pick up your cross, and you have to deny yourself. You can forget about comfort. Too often we equate comfort with material blessings. You know, I've got cars and a house and all that. And we don't get into the emotional discomfort of stepping out of what's easy for us so that we do what Jesus would do. Maybe for some of us, questions don't come naturally. So what would Jesus do? Maybe he'd spend some time at home a few days before church thinking about what questions can I ask to engage people, to draw them out, to be a diakonos to them, to minister to them, or to be a doulos to them, to try to figure out what needs there are. How about once we sing? How would Jesus sing? How about when anybody gets up here to share or speak, how would Jesus engage that person? How would he listen to the things that are being shared? Or what would Jesus do in the lunch afterwards? Would he just sort of wait until the lunch is ready and then go help himself and come back? I mean, what would Jesus do? Again, would he just sort of keep to himself or keep to what was comfortable for him? By the way, I will point out here, I think some of us are much more naturally servants than others. I'm not one of them. Just speaking honestly, I'm not. I have to constantly tell myself, and when I don't, I have to be told, you know, at home, can you kind of get up and help? That's a confession. I think honestly, many of our women are much more naturally servants than men. But I'm still left with the question of what would Jesus do? Is it, will the women just go make lunch and that's what they do and then we'll go and eat it afterwards? To remember the words Jesus used, he came to give his life away. He came to serve. So if Jesus came this morning, which I believe he did, he would come to empty himself. He would make himself last. How? By coming to diakonos, to minister to others, and by coming as a doulos, seeking out the needs of others in ways that he can meet those needs. And I said early on, church is kind of a funny thing in that we all come, we know the right things to say and the right ways to be. This is not just for our corporate times of worship. This is for all of life. It's how we are at home. It's how we are at work. It's even how we are at the store. Right? I go grocery shopping. Why do I go grocery shopping? Is it primarily to go buy the groceries? Not if I'm a doulos. I don't think Jesus ever would go grocery shopping because his primary purpose was to go grocery shopping. Yes, he had to eat, he had to drink, right? Sat down with the woman at the well. He was thirsty. But you quickly see why he came and what he was thinking. We're supposed to be like this all the time. And I don't know about you, but I mean, this is the stuff I've been meditating on. This is the stuff I've been praying about. This is the stuff I feel deeply convicted about in my whole life. I am really challenged. Even this whole notion of training my mind to think all the time, what would Jesus do? And then doing that, because it is a mindset. And we've just touched on one area today. Right? There's a whole bunch of other ones that Lord willing, if there's opportunity, I'd love to share more of what I'm learning and what I'm studying. But I want to remind us, just listen. I want to remind us of the words of John. This is how we are sure that we have come to know Him, by keeping His commands. The one who says, I have come to know Him, yet doesn't keep His commands, is a liar, and the truth is not in him. But whoever keeps His word, truly in him, the love of God is perfected. This is how we know we are in Him. The one who says he remains in Him must walk just as Jesus walked. Let's pray.